Have you ever pondered what would happen if souls could still contact with us after death? And if the circle of life were more than just a basic idea? Imagine being in front of a garden that not only adds beauty, but also conceals a sinister secret that has the power to permanently alter your understanding of life and death. I encourage you to immerse yourself in this tale, which examines the delicate boundary between beauty and the mab, where memories turn into death screams and flowers are more than just plants. My name is Samuel, and for years I have worked as a gardener in the old cemetery of the city. It is a quiet place, or at least that is what the old tombstones covered in moss and the distant singing of the birds attempt to make you believe. But if there is one thing I have learned from this profession, it is that death has its own language. A language that only a few manage to understand. At first, my days were spent pruning shrubs and caring for the plants that adorn the grave. However, over time, I began to notice something strange. The flowers I planted on some graves seemed to come alive in a disquieting way. Their colors were more vibrant, and their petals danced in the wind in a manner almost human. With each new dawn, I also noticed that these little flowers had an uncanny resemblance to the deceased beneath them. It was as if each plant carried a piece of the soul of the person buried there, a unique connection that both fascinated and terrified me. At the same time, I couldn't help but question whether I was truly seeing what I thought I was seeing. I became obsessed with this idea, and as time went on, I decided to turn it into an art form. I began to create the most extraordinary create a garden, where every flower will act as a memento of the departed. Soon, the graveyard was transformed into a lovely flower garden, with each plant bearing a unique bloom from the departed, some of which had bright eyes. It was a stunning and terrible sight to see, but this is where the story takes a nasty turn, as each flower that sprouted was followed by others wearing eternal smiles. At first they were gentle, but I started to sense their weight, as though the departed souls were starting to speak to me. Whispers that resembled a faraway echo pleading to be remembered quickly transformed into heartbreaking cries, begging the return of their loved ones. When I heard a voice calling me one afternoon while watering the flowers, I recognized it as my deceased grandmother's voice. She always spoke to me in a way that seemed to be filled with love, but this time her tone was one of desperation and sadness, and she wanted me to help her get in touch with her family. It was then that I started to feel uncontrollably anxious. The families who had previously visited the graves began to neglect them, as if an invisible chasm had opened between them and the memories of those they had loved. These souls were retrieving something that was rightfully theirs, in addition to looking for company. I was enmeshed in an internal conflict. Making these lovely, vibrant flowers was enjoyable, but I also realized I was experimenting with forces I didn't entirely comprehend. I persisted in planting more and more every day, in spite of my grandmother's cautions. My garden turned into a flurry of groans, cries, and murmurs as the flowers grew more demanding. I was gripped with dread as the spirits started to appear. I saw creatures I had loved in the past, as well as ones whose backstories I had never heard. Tragically, a person's flowers started to wither. If they didn't get the attention they wanted, they dried up and turned into shadows of their former selves, pleading for their relatives to come back and remember their legacy. I was so overcome with guilt that I was at a loss for what to do. In an attempt to fill the emptiness of death with the beauty of life, I was a gardener who had planted more than just flowers. I had nurtured a cacophony of lost souls. The strain grew unbearable as the days went by. The flowers were more than just recollections. They were a struggle for survival. A continual reminder that I, Samuel, was the one who could determine who was worthy of being in my garden. I could take it no more. I made the decision that I had to stop it one night amid the cries and cries. In an attempt to find some calm in the midst of the storm, I shut off the lights and closed my eyes. Then a heartbreaking scream rang out across the night. It was my voice mixed with the voices of everyone who has visited my garden. Every flower that touched my skin was a cry of agony, and my hands turned into fertile ground as the garden took me. I realized that I had lost control and that my very essence was dissolving as the souls called out to be heard. As the wind blew through the flowers I had once planted with love, I realized that the memories of the souls I had cultivated could never be forgotten, and that my garden would stand as a dark monument to the stories that, despite being forgotten, continued to bloom even in the realm of the dead. The last thing I felt was an overwhelming wave of sadness as my own body changed into a Maub garden where each flower screamed in the voice of someone I had known. It became an endless cycle of life and death, a death trap from which I was unable to escape. Now the next one. Life might be unexpected at times, us in ways that are frightening and unfathomable. If you were working in a facility one day and the presence of previous employees was so powerful that it was terrifying, have you ever considered what you would do? Imagine working as a security guard in a huge skyscraper with empty floors that were once occupied by people, only to find out that the security cameras were recording activities that shouldn't be there. Here's the tale. A few weeks ago, I went through something that made me question my sanity and left me with a knot in my stomach that I still can't get rid of. My story starts on a typical day when I worked the night shift in a modern office building that I had grown to know well. The lobby's neon lights wavered here and there, creating eerie shadows on the walls. There was an odd tension in the air as I sat down in front of the security monitors. It's like someone is watching you from behind. Until I noticed something, the practice of checking the images on the screens grew monotonous. Unusual movement was visible on the screen of one of the cameras on the 10th floor. I saw figures moving smoothly, as though they were going about their regular business. I initially believed it to be a technological issue, but after looking more closely, I recognized faces, figures I had seen in pictures in the Human Resources Department. They were all previous workers of the business who perished in a terrible fire that ruthlessly destroyed a portion of the structure. Every night, the same shadows appeared on the screen, moving diligently from one side to the other. The images were clear, and I couldn't ignore what was happening. Years ago, my heart began to race. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I felt like an intruder in a world that I thought had been closed forever. I wondered if any other guards had noticed the same thing, but every time I mentioned the figures to my coworkers, they would laugh and say, "You're imagining things." They would respond, "I'm just the play of shadows." But I knew what I was seeing was real despite their protests. As I walked past the filing office, I realized I wanted more information on the fire that had killed so many people. When I looked through historical records and reports on the incident, I found that many of the people involved had unresolved disputes in addition to the deaths. I could relate to the tales of conflict and miscommunication that were kept inside the building's walls. It was clear that the location had served as both their home and a place where their horrors and dreams coexisted. I felt compelled to take action. I needed to know why their ghosts were still inside the structure. The next evening, when the tower was enveloped in darkness, I decided to ascend to the 10th floor, which was the epicenter of the paranormal activity. I was determined to document any irregularities with every step I took in the direction of the lift, so I packed my camera and recorder. When I got to the 10th floor and opened the door, a cold feeling came over me. I was met by a chilling air that seemed to be a voice from a long-forgotten past. There was a sense of tension in the hallway as the lights flickered dimly and the darkness was nearly tangible. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but I had the impression that someone was watching me. After switching on my recorder, I started talking and inquired if anyone was present. My voice was the sole response at first, but after a few moments of silence, a heartbreaking murmur spoke up. "Please help us." The voice echoed like a despairing echo across the walls. My instinct was to turn around and flee, but something inside of me forced me to stay because I wanted to know what was going on. That's when I noticed a blurry figure in the corner of the room, a woman with long hair and a pale face, staring at me intently as though she was waiting for me to do something. I asked her to approach, and to my surprise, the figure started to slowly approach me. As the figure drew closer, the air became thicker, and a plethora of memories and feelings started to appear in that empty space. "We cannot rest," she murmured, her voice so ethereal that it seemed to flow with the wind. "Our stories have become trapped in this place, and we do not know how to free ourselves." The people who had lived there started to share their tales with me, and I could feel their sorrow. Each account was a thread weaving a network of connections between them and between the places where they had spent so much time. Examples included the young man who lost his first love in the fire, the mother who left her children to pursue her career and had no time to say goodbye, and the employee who had a final argument with his boss just before everything went wrong. In addition to being imprisoned by their deaths, I understood that their disputes and feelings persisted in the atmosphere, as though the fire had engulfed not just their bodies, but also their ambitions and dreams. I started to have a great deal of sympathy for them. "How may I assist you?" My voice quivered with the experience's intensity as I asked. The woman hesitated, her eyes full of unshed tears as she gazed at me. "Pay attention to us and keep in mind our tales. Only then, with my heart in my hand, can we find peace. I vowed to do everything in my power to share their tales." Every night I brought my notepad and recorder back to the 10th floor. As the lights flickered and the atmosphere was filled with a mixture of optimism and despair, I listened to each of their stories one after the other. The burden of their suffering started to lessen with each tale. I saw how their once depressing and solemn features started to display signs of healing and serenity. The sessions turned like a ritual, and every interaction gave me a sense of purpose in addition to a knot in my stomach. I realized that by telling their experiences, I was assisting them in escaping the imperceptible bonds that held them back. One evening, after hearing a number of them talk about their final day in the building, I was left with a vivid vision of a middle-aged man who had been searching over documents right before the fire. His expression was filled with anguish. "I couldn't save my co-workers," he told me, his voice shaking as his anguish started to change. The man gradually faded before my eyes, his figure illuminated by a soft light like dawn. He said, "Thank you for listening to me. Now I can rest," before vanishing into a sphere of light. It was a beautiful and heartbreaking moment with him, as his fears left him, and one by one more faces started to find their way to freedom. After a few nights, a few ghosts lingered in the room, but one presence persisted. One night, a young woman's figure appeared before me. It was the same woman I had seen the first time, but this time her smile was radiant. "There is still something left to do," she said, and all the lights in the hallway suddenly came on. "We are free now, and we appreciate you listening and providing us with tranquility so that we can rest." The place is illuminated as though the sun had risen in the middle of the night. As though an unseen burden had been removed, I could feel the air around me becoming lighter. One by one, the shadows vanished, leaving behind nothing except the sound of their voices. As the lights gradually went out, I stood there feeling content and moved. I was confident that I had accomplished my goal of helping the building's former occupants and giving voice to their worthy stories. That evening, I came home feeling conflicted. I was happy to have contributed to their freedom, but I was also grieved for the lives lost. The building appeared less menacing and brighter now. After that night, I had the impression that things had changed and that the former workers had at last found peace. Remember that we are not alone if you have ever had the feeling that someone is watching you or that the stories of our ancestors are still present. Stories are always waiting to be told. Please feel free to leave a like if you like this narration and would like to hear more stories like this one. Please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment with your opinions. In order to keep bringing you more stories that make your skin crawl and your heart race, your support is essential. We'll investigate more of the mysteries that surround us when we meet again.